Let's get started.
But I'll be back a lot because I saw the list of yours, your 7, and I only like 2.
For next week, we have one volunteer already, and that's Liang, who's absent today, but he wanted to call dibs on it. So the main reading for next week is Benjamin's Surrealism essay. So could I get another volunteer for that? Okay, great. We also have 2 more autobiographical writings by Benjamin that are in the mode of, so we're familiar with this, that Benjamin sometimes writes in the mode of what he's talking about, and that's Marseille and Hashish in Marseille. And we have Convolute K, this sort of background supplemental reading, the folder from the Arcades project. As additional notes. Okay, so today we've looked at the Ragpicker's Wine, Beauty, and To a Passerby previously, and we've also looked at On the Mimetic Faculty previously. Those were on the syllabus for this week, just so you guys could sort of mentally put yourself back in the place of those pieces and having them in mind when reading Breton's Mad Love. As I mentioned, Benjamin's Surrealism essay that we're reading next week is written before Breton wrote Mad Love, and so he's writing about another book by Breton in particular called Nausea. Written like 10 years prior. And I will say something about Mad Love, the moment that he's writing, which is around the time that Benjamin was writing his work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So a lot of things are going on in 1936. He's writing in the aftermath of some of the events of 1936. And he talks about it, of course, in Mad Love, Breton. World War II is essentially broken out. So if you recall from the work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, again, I assume you guys will have read that in other classes. And so it's not on our syllabus, but I assume it is kind of background. The epilogue mentions the Marinetti Futurist Manifesto and makes mention of the Marinetti and the Futurists supported Mussolini fascism in Italy. Talks about the aesthetics of war, and the example is the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. So it's one of the controversial events of 1936. Italy invades Libya and Ethiopia, trying to establish hegemony in the Mediterranean. Japan is already occupying parts of China, but vastly expands their invasion of China. And the Spanish Civil War breaks out and is concluded in 1936. So Franco, who establishes a fascist regime in Spain, eventually, so he launches an attack on the Republic in Spain that is resisted by communists and socialists and anarchists and other liberals. The Republic is defended, and Britain, France, and the United States are neutral in the Spanish Civil War, but fascist Italy and Nazi Germany are active supporters of Franco. And the Soviet Union backs the Republic. And is part of they have a military expeditionary force, their military presence in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So it's a left cause. It's part of the Popular Front Against War and Fascism that had been established in 1935, if I'm not mistaken, by the Soviet Union and by the Communist International, the Comintern. Breton and the Surrealists are part of this general left fellow traveler milieu in the 1930s. They're more aligned with Trotsky and the Trotskyists than they are with the Stalinists, but nonetheless they're in the same milieu. Another piece that we don't read in this course, but is included in the Reflections book that we have, is the author as producer. And that's a speech that Benjamin gives in 1934, or it's a draft of a speech that he never actually gave, but to the Institute for the Study of Fascism in Paris. and he makes reference there to the Surrealists, and tries to make an intervention with respect to a Marxist attitude towards cultural production and art in his own time in the 20th century. And he criticizes some of the formulations of some of the Surrealists, like Louis Aragon. So I bring all of this up because Breton and the Surrealists are very actively politically involved in the 1930s. This is a kind of a late stage that we're engaging Surrealism via Mad Love. There are some controversies already bubbling up within the Surrealist movement, we might say, or within the group. Breton is the Pope of Surrealism, like he's the main guy. But one way of thinking about the division that occurs within Surrealism in the late 1930s is between Breton and Bataille, Georges Bataille. And Bataille is the Nietzschean and the materialist, and Breton is the Hegelian and the idealist. One way of thinking about it. I think that postmodernists like Bataille and they don't like Breton because postmodernists have an affinity for Nietzscheanism contra Hegelianism. So Hegelianism is seen as totalitarian and seen as contributing to the bad sides of Marxism and to Stalinism and all sorts of other things. So, but Benjamin is personally acquainted with and close to both Breton and Bataille, in fact. And Bataille is responsible for keeping Benjamin's papers safe during the Nazi occupation. So it's Bataille who has Benjamin's stuff, has the Arcades Project, has the notes for the Arcades Project, has a lot of drafts of Benjamin's writings, and gives them to Adorno after the war. 1935, we're going to engage this later in the course when we read the expose for the Arcades Project, Paris, the capital of the 19th century. In a couple of weeks we'll be reading that. From 1935. In 1935 there was a world exposition. Actually, it's not the world exposition, it's the colonial exposition. It's the French colonial exposition in Paris in 1935. And the Surrealists organize a counter exhibition to protest the colonial exposition. And Breton and Bataille are both involved, but this introduces what's known as ethnographic surrealism, related to anthropological surrealism. So what they do, their counter exhibit to the colonial exhibit. So the colonial exhibit has like dioramas of living, acting dioramas of the cultures from the various French colonies. And so the Surrealists, their counter exhibition has scenes from French life, right? So it's basically turning the ethnographic gaze onto France, but of course it's also the not just the ethnographic gaze or the anthropological gaze, but it's the Surrealist gaze, right? Turned back onto French life. Meaning trying to estrange people from French ordinary life as much as French people might think of the exotic cultures of the colonies from a distance. Right. So I bring this up because surrealism, the very concept of surrealism, I think is generally misunderstood. First of all, we have the common popular use of the term surreal to mean sort of fantastical or other than real. No, surrealism is supposed to be ultra real. So surrealism is supposed to be super realist, super realism. It's not supposed to be something other than realism. And that's the sort of concept of surrealism. And so it's supposed to intensify and find the kind of quintessence of reality rather than be an alternative to reality. Now we're going to see with Breton, the Surrealists are inspired not only by Marx, they're Marxists, but also by Freud. And so there are Freudian categories that relate to the surreal or the surrealism that are also often misunderstood, like the Freud's notion of the uncanny. Right, so the uncanny is when something that's very normal, like extremely ordinary, suddenly feels strange and mysterious. And that's because an unconscious association is happening. So it's like you feel it, but like rationally it doesn't make sense why something very ordinary suddenly feels uncanny. Right, so it's in Freudian terms, it's a phenomenon of the conflict of the conscious and the unconscious. Right, so to try to make the ordinary seem mysterious is to try to bring out the unconscious aspect of ordinary life. Right, the repressed, we might say, as well. Because of course the surrealists think of themselves as radical, as subversive. Right, they think with their project as not only an aesthetic one but a political one. And so there's an immediate similarity that we can observe between Brecht and surrealism, namely that Brecht, the estrangement effect, the alienation effect in Brechtian drama, the surrealists are trying to do the same thing, which is how to make the ordinary strange. And what the content of that is. Like, in other words, what's the motivation for that? What's the intention of that? It's not just to make things weird. No, it's to bring out what is repressed in everyday life. To use a Freudian expression, the psychopathology of everyday life. And then later, like a situationist, Lefebvre has the critique of everyday life. The situationism later is inspired by surrealism. Right, so how to grasp everyday life critically? Like these are, people are trying to adopt procedures for achieving this. How do you denaturalize or unfamiliarize the ordinary, the familiar? Like how can you get people to reconsider, look again at what they otherwise take for granted and find natural? I will also say regarding the surrealists, that they're, like I said, fellow traveler leftists, socialists, communists, Marxists. They're also associated, and especially Breton in particular, is associated with Trotsky in the 30s. So Trotsky ghostwrites some of the surrealist manifestos with Breton in the 30s. So unlike others, we've talked about this, about how Stalinism established a kind of repressive attitude with respect to modernism in the name of socialist realism. Trotsky is not one of those people, right? So Trotsky is definitely not an anti-modernist. And he's very critical of socialist realism as like a kind of bureaucrat's idea of cultural policy. Now I mentioned this because, I talked about the futurists already. So early in the revolution, Trotsky had written a book called Literature and Revolution in 1923. And it was basically trying to make an argument for why the Soviet Union should have a laissez-faire policy towards art and culture. Because there were a lot of radical art and cultural movements that attached themselves to the revolution and who were all claiming that their movement, their preferred practice of art, their preferred cultural practices were the true revolutionary thing to be done and truly proletarian and truly socialist or communist. And he said, no, this is all just modernism. It's just an expression of capitalism. And eventually we'll get a socialist culture, but it won't even be a socialist culture, it'll be a human culture, but in the meantime we're dealing with bourgeois culture, and bourgeois culture in extremis, namely modernism, And yes, artists like to tell themselves that their work is like a new social principle, but it's just a sort of radicalization of bourgeois art, and it's just an expression of capitalism. And so the state shouldn't pick and choose among the different movements, but provide support to them equally and have a hands-off policy. Right. So, so the best you can have is revolutionary art, but revolutionary art just means art that is like propagandistically tied to the politics of the revolution. But even that like is tenuous. It's just like the intention of the artist. There's nothing inherent about any particular artistic style that makes it more proletarian or socialist or revolutionary either. Whereas again, all the cultural radicals are claiming that their approach is the true revolutionary approach, the true proletarian approach, the true socialist or communist approach. He's saying no. And the reason for that, I'm mentioning all this because it's, it's involved in how Breton approaches things and how it's really involved in how Benjamin approaches things, because Benjamin is deeply influenced by this book. Literature and Revolution by Trotsky. It makes a huge impact on him, on his attitude about these things. That it goes to the Marxist understanding of the proletarian socialist revolution at all, which is how it differs from the bourgeois democratic revolution. So bourgeois culture developed within feudalism. It developed out of the late Middle Ages. It developed in the Renaissance. It developed in civil society. So bourgeois culture, because bourgeois social relations developed within the old traditional civilization until it gradually displaced it. And then you get this political revolution at the end that shows that something has changed, and then they have to bring the political system in line with the social system. So you get the political revolutions come after the social revolution. So the social revolution is over hundreds of years, and then the political revolutions happen in the 17th and 18th centuries. The English Civil War, the English Glorious Revolution, the Dutch Revolt, the American and French Revolutions all come after bourgeois society had established itself within feudalist structures, and then they just dispense with the feudalist structures. But the Marxist understanding of socialism, and the proletarian socialism in particular, is that it does not develop within capitalism. That all that develops within capitalism is the working class organizing itself to be able to take state power. So all you get is like the development of like a proletarian socialist movement, but it's organized along bourgeois and even capitalist principles. And then the political revolution happens, and then that's the beginning of the social revolution. So the political revolution doesn't come after the social revolution, the political revolution comes before the social revolution. And the dictatorship of the proletariat is still ruling over capitalism.
That's for who?
That's Marx and Engels.
Marx.
Yeah, that's Marx and Engels. And it's Trotsky. It's why would Trotsky would say, well, of course you can't have proletarian art because that's just capitalist art. And it's, you can't have socialist art because we don't have socialism. We're dealing with capitalism. And, again, we have bourgeois art, but in contradiction and crisis with itself, which means we have modernism. So the political change happens first, and then the social change happens, meaning capitalism can only be abolished gradually. It can't be abolished all at once. And the only thing the working class can do is take political power and rule over capitalism. But it's still capitalism. So that's the Marx and Engels understanding, and also Lenin's understanding. It's Lenin's understanding and Trotsky's understanding. It's basically the understanding of all Marxists before Stalinists had to come in and pretend that what they were doing was socialism for propagandistic reasons. They had to pretend the Soviet Union achieved socialism. By the way, 1936 is when the Soviet Union declared that it achieved socialism. No, they had not. And so the Chinese Communist Party is a lot wiser about these things. They say that China might entered the early stage of socialism in 2050. Okay, so why does all this matter? Because what it means is that, especially insofar as the Surrealists started out, like not terribly seriously Marxist, but they became more Marxist, especially in the 30s, it meant that they had a changed understanding of what they were doing. They had a changed understanding of the significance of their own cultural radicalism. And that's the Breton that we're intersecting now, as opposed to the Breton that we'll be reading about next week. The Breton that we're reading about next week, Benjamin has a very harsh kind of criticism of. Because he's like, okay, these guys think that they're radical and revolutionary, but actually they're just your typical bohemian bourgeois types. And he pours a lot of cold water on them. And, attacks them for being like, mystical, and, you'll see, we'll get there. But the criticism is of their self-understanding. He thinks that what they're doing is more interesting than what they think they're doing. Like what they're actually doing is more interesting than what they say they're doing. But that doesn't apply to the Breton we're reading now for this week. Because Breton had sort of developed in a more Marxist self-understanding. It has a different tone to it. It has a more wistful tone to it. It has a kind of more kind of sober tone to it than Nausea, which is kind of a crazy book. France. So I mentioned the Popular Front Against War and Fascism. That's the policy of the communists that informs like the participation of communists in the Spanish Civil War, which they did. Americans went to fight in the Spanish Civil War in the Lincoln Brigades, but also others went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And we'll see what Breton has to say about that. So volunteers went. And 1936, so what's going on in France is that you actually have a Popular Front government in France. Meaning a kind of united left government in France to fight off the right, because in France there are pro-fascists. There's a pro-fascist right in France called Action Française, and those are the people who eventually collaborate with the Nazis and set up the Vichy Republic after the Nazis invade. So that's all going on, like in the 30s. That's going on for like almost a decade before Vichy happens. So again, the world around Breton is a highly polarized world. Every country seems to be polarizing along communists versus fascists. And, World War II has already begun. So we conventionally date World War II to the, to the partition of Poland between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. But that initiates the Phony War. The Phony War, which is France and Britain fighting the Nazis nominally to defend Poland. But then the real war happens when the Nazis invade France in 1940. And then in the United States, of course, there's another year before it hits home because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Right. So, but really, World War II had already broken out. For all intents and purposes, 1936 is really the beginning of World War II, especially from the left perspective of these guys, right? So we'll see, like he's looking out onto a world consuming itself and thinking about some distant post-apocalyptic future with his daughter. He's like, who knows what world you're going to live in, and, but because that is what's going on, in fact. And who knows what world we've been living in since then, in fact. We should not take for granted the world that we live in. Meaning, in the United States, we can sort of take for granted, Britain and the United States held out. Europe was completely controlled by the fascists, total, complete. And which meant also the colonial world that Europe controlled was also, except for the British colonies and the United States and Latin America. And so there is this kind of, we can lose sight of just how strong the fascist presence was in terms of the tone of Breton. And what I'll also say about that is, again, when I mentioned Mussolini, fascism had already begun much earlier in the wake of World War I. And the general view of the interwar years of people on the left was that this was the sort of decisive crisis of history. So in 2025, we're like living as if it didn't happen. So we invoke these things like Trump's a fascist or whatever. We don't really mean it's like like. So we live in the aftermath of catastrophe, and this is the catastrophe. So when we're going to be reading Benjamin on Surrealism, we're going to be reading more about from the Arcades Project. We're going to be getting into more of this kind of apocalyptic time of the 1930s in particular. And I think that we can sort of take it falsely for granted now that even when we invoke these things, when people are like neo-Stalinist and communist and like invoke like fascism and all this stuff, that it's like a pantomime. It's obviously like people don't really mean it. They don't take it very seriously, right? So we're dealing with like the real thing now. We have to try to remind ourselves of that. This isn't a metaphor. Like fascism's not a metaphor, and communism's not a metaphor. And it did look like the world. So I mentioned Trotsky. Like Trotsky didn't think that capitalism could survive World War II. He didn't think it would be possible to continue after World War II. Very optimistic, super optimistic, right? So he thought that either the world would descend into fascism and slavery or it would go communist. And it's kind of like, well, it kind of did both and neither. That's a Hegelian expression. It's both and neither. Whenever you're faced with an either or, the answer is both and neither. That's dialectics. Right, so we live in a post-fascist world. Right, not an anti-fascist world, but officially we live in an anti-fascist world, like the United Nations and all that stuff, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all that great stuff. Like, we live in an officially anti-fascist world. No, we live in a post-fascist world. I say that only because I had to channel the spirit of Benjamin's colleague, Adorno, who survived it. Right, and the Frankfurt School after World War II, their attitude is that fascism won. Fascism was defeated, and its defeat it actually won. Right, so post-fascist, not anti-fascist. But one of the ways that we hide that from ourselves is to pretend that we live in an anti-fascist world. Okay. Breton. This dedication is Breton's own dedication, I think. We have the translator's dedication as well, so let's Mad Love was written for Jacqueline Lamba, an artist, and the heroine of The Night of the Sunflower, whose singular and mysterious beauty, whose intensity of character marks the address of its pages, in the name of Ave, the daughter born of Andre Breton and Jacqueline, and to the last letter is dedicated. In this name of dawn, there is suggested a whole day opening out from his pages into some other space. Pausing on this because notice time becomes space. Right, so like dawn suggests a moment in time, but then he says the book opens a spatial metaphor onto another space. If you recall from the Berlin childhood, or the Berlin Chronicle. The dream of spatializing time. Action becoming an image. Like all these sort of ideas we've had previously. Let's keep them all going in mind. We're trying to read this in a Benjamin state of mind, we might say. Okay, so let's look at the opening bit by Breton. His opening image. Boys of harsh discipline, nameless actors, chained and brilliant, from the grand musical that will always occupy the mental theater with no hope for change, have always mysteriously evoked for me certain theoretical beings whom I interpret as key bearers, possessing the clues to situations. I mean that they hold the secret of the most meaningful attitudes I shall have to take in the presence of some rare events which will have left their mark upon me. So situations, if you remember Benjamin's, what is epic theater with Brecht? Right, so situation. And I mentioned the situationists as followers of Surrealism. So it's this idea of the situation. These characters habitually appear to me dressed in black, probably in full dress. Their faces escape me, but I think there are 7 or so of them, seated next to each other on a bench, talking among themselves, always looking straight ahead. That is the way I should have liked to put them on stage in the play's opening scene, their role being to unveil, with a certain cynicism, the motives for the action. At nightfall, and often much later, I know perfectly well that psychoanalysis would have something to say about this. As if they were submitting to a ritual, I find them wandering speechless by the sea in single file, winding lightly around the waves. So, when he says, revealing with a certain cynicism the motives for the action, we talked a little bit about this with Brecht, with the epic theater and Aristotle, and Aristotelian tragedy having this device that we don't normally have now, the chorus. Right, and so the chorus is a kind of intermediary between the audience and the characters, and they're commenting on the action, so the audience always knows the tragic fate that is awaiting the protagonist, and is sort of telling the audience like how and why this is the case. And so they're not speaking with the voice of the gods, but they're kind of speaking with the knowledge that the gods have. Right, so now we also talked about the tragedy and comedy, the difference between the two is that tragedy is about the will of the gods. It's about the kind of cosmic battles of the divine forces, and we're the kind of playthings in those battles. Whereas comedy is about human action, human situations. So tragedy is about the will of the gods, the actions of the gods, what they make happen. And comedy is about what we make happen. Now, what's happened in bourgeois drama is that there are characters who take on the role of the chorus, who like comment on things and sort of break the fourth wall a little bit, speak to the audience, sort of let us know what's going on. And we had that a little bit in Baal. We had these sort of ordinary people who are able to see Baal in a way that his friends and lovers are not able to see him in the action. Okay, so it's important where he's placing the row of boys in terms of his imagined play. Okay, wandering speechless by the sea in single file, winding lightly around the waves. Coming from them, the silence is no hardship. Their conversation on that bench, always having seemed to me to tell the truth, singularly disconnected. If I were to try to find antecedents in literature for them, I might have come up with Jarry's Polonablu, where a litigious language like theirs flows easily with no immediate exchange value. Haldernablu, which also ends with an evocation very close to my own, in the triangular forest after dusk. So you'll notice exchange value. Let's bring up the commodity form right away. Why must this phantasm be irresistibly followed by another one, obviously located at the antipodes of the first? In the construction of the ideal play I was speaking of, it manages to have the final curtain fall upon an episode that is lost backstage, or is at least played out on the stage at an uncommon depth. Some imperious concern for equilibrium is in control here, opposing from one day to the next any variation. The rest of the play is a matter of caprice. That is, as I immediately tend to understand it, it is scarcely worth dreaming up. I like to imagine all the enlightenment that the spectator will have enjoyed converging on this shadowy point. Now, again, this brings up something. Like, what's the purpose of art? Like, what's the purpose of drama? So the purpose of tragedy is to enlighten us as to our existential condition, our cosmic condition, our situation, to enlighten us about our situation. Comedy is also meant to enlighten us as to our situation, namely our social and political situation. So art is meant to be enlightening. All art is supposed to be enlightening. It's supposed to serve an enlightening function. That's the basic idea. Oh, what a praiseworthy grasp of the problem, what good-hearted laughter and tears, a human taste for accepting or rejecting, what temperate climes. But suddenly, perhaps again, the bench we just saw, it doesn't matter, or some cafe bench, the scene is blocked off once more. Blocked off this time by a row of seated women in pale clothes, the most appealing they have ever worn. Symmetry dictates they must be 7 or 9. And man enters and recognizes them, one after the other, all at once. They are the women he has loved, who have loved him, some for years, others for one day. How dark it is. It's because I'm absolutely forbidden to imagine, in such a case, the behavior of any man at all, as long as he is a coward. This man in whose place I have so often been, but I can't think of anything more pathetic. He scarcely is at all, this living man who would hoist himself up on this treacherous trapeze of time. He would be unable even to exist without forgetfulness, that ferocious beast with its larva-like features. The wonderful little diamond slipper was heading off in several directions. We must try to glide not too quickly between the two impossible tribunals facing each other. The first of the lovers I shall have been, so the boys are all versions of himself. The other of these women I see all in pale clothes. So the same river swirls, snatches, sheds its veils, and runs by under the spell of the sweetness of the stones, the shadows, and the grasses. The water, mad for its swirls like a real main of fire. To glide like water into pure sparkle, for that we would have to have lost the notion of time. But what defense is there against it? Who will teach us to decant the joy of memory? History does not say that romantic poets, although they have composed for themselves a less dramatic conception of love than ours, have succeeded in confronting the storm. On the contrary, the examples of Shelley, Nerval, Arnim illustrate in a striking way the conflict which will be progressively more bitter until our time. For the mind chooses to believe that the loved object is a unique being, whereas often social conditions of life can destroy such an illusion. This largely explains, I believe, the feeling of malediction weighing on man today and expressing itself so acutely through the most characteristic works of this last century, making due allowance for the use of any means needed to transform the world and notably to suppress these social obstacles. It is nevertheless perhaps not useless to persuade ourselves that this idea of a unique love comes from a mystic attitude, which doesn't mean it can't be nourished by contemporary society for its own dubious ends. All the same, I think I see a possible synthesis of this idea and its negation. It is not, in fact, just the parallel lineup of these two rows of men and women I was just pretending to see earlier as equals that persuades me how likely it is that the man in question, in all these faces of men called up, in which he finally recognizes only himself, will discover at the same time in all these women's faces one face only, the last face loved. How many times, moreover, have I noticed that under extremely dissimilar appearances, one exceptional trait was developing, and one attitude that I might have thought taken from me forever. However distressing such an hypothesis remains for me, it could be that in this domain, substituting one person for another, or even several others, tends towards an always clearer definition of the physical aspect of the beloved, through the always increasing subjectivization of desire. The beloved would then be the one in whom would mingle a certain number of particular qualities considered more appealing than the others and appreciated separately, successively, in all the beings loved to some extent previously. This proposition corroborates in a dogmatic form the popular notion of the type of woman or man, or of the individual man or woman considered alone. I am saying that here as elsewhere this notion, being the fruit of a collective judgment tried and proved, appears fortunately to correct another one emerging from one of those innumerable idealistic pretensions which have proved themselves intolerable in the long run. And it is there, right in the depths of the human crucible, in this paradoxical region where the fusion of two beings who have really chosen each other renders to all things the lost colors of the times of ancient suns, where, however, loneliness rages also, in one of nature's fantasies, which around the Alaskan craters demands that under the ashes there remains snow. It is there that years ago I asked that we look for a new beauty, a beauty envisaged exclusively to produce passion. I confess without the slightest embarrassment my profound insensitivity to the presence of natural spectacles and of those works of art which do not straight off arouse a physical sensation in me, like the feeling of a feathery wind brushing across my temples to produce a real shiver. I could never avoid establishing some relation between this sensation and that of the erotic pleasure, finding only a difference of degree. Although I never managed to exhaust by analysis all the elements of this disquiet, it must in fact come from my repressed feelings. All I know of it persuades me that there sexuality alone presides. Naturally, in these conditions, the very special emotion aroused can rise up for me at the most unexpected times and be caused by something or someone not, on the whole, particularly dear to me. It is nonetheless clearly a question of that kind of emotion and not of another. I insist that I cannot be mistaken in this. It is really as if I had been lost and they had come to give me some news about myself. The first time I visited Paul Valéry, when I was 17, I remember his insistent questions about my reasons for devoting myself to poetry. I responded already along the same lines. I was only trying, I said to him, to obtain, to procure for myself states of mind like those which certain odd poetic movements had aroused in me. It is striking and admirable that such states of perfect receptivity suffer no diminution in time, because among the examples I am now tempted to give of those short formulas having a magic effect on me, several of those I proposed to Valéry more than 20 years ago return. For example, I remember so well how salubrious a wind from Rimbaud's The River Acassus, or Then as the Night Was Aging of Mallarmé from Poe. And perhaps most of all, the conclusion of this advice from a mother to her daughter in a story by Louise, to be wary, I think, of the young men going along the road with the evening wind and winged dust. Need I say that such extremely rare cases, with the discovery sometime later of Isidore Ducasse and his Chants du Maldoror and his poems, then blossomed into an unexpected profusion. Lautréamont's beautiful as a constitutes the very manifesto of convulsive poetry. Big bright eyes of dawn or willow, of fern, crosier, of drum or saffron. The most beautiful eyes of museums or of life open wide at their approach as flowers spread open so as to see no longer upon all the branches of the air. Okay, so convulsive poetry, convulsive beauty. Convulsive poetry, convulsive beauty. So we talked about this with Baudelaire. So the ideal of beauty is that it should make you convulse, that something is only beautiful if it causes you to convulse. Somewhat different from the Kantian idea. The Kantian idea is a sympathetic resonance between subject and object. Or even a romantic idea, which would be a kind of reconciliation with nature, reconciliation between subject and object. So this is empathy, to use Benjamin's language with respect to Baudelaire, but it's the empathy of convulsion. Convulsive. Okay, let's jump ahead here. The word convulsive, which I used to describe the only beauty which should concern us, would lose all meaning in my eyes were it to be conceived in motion, and not at the exact expiration of this motion. So recall what we've talked about before, action becoming an image. Right, the quotable gesture, the gestus. So it's when action freezes into an image. So convulsive beauty is not to be conceived in motion, but rather at the exact expiration of this motion. There can be no beauty at all as far as I am concerned, convulsive beauty, except at the cost of affirming the reciprocal relations, linking the object seen in its motion and in its repose. I regret not having been able to furnish along with this text the photograph of a speeding locomotive abandoned for years to the delirium of a virgin forest. Besides wanting to see that, which I find particularly exaltating, it seems to me that the most magical aspect of this monument to victory and to disaster would have been that of capturing ideas. Moving from force to fragility, I see myself now in a grotto in the Vaucluse, contemplating a little limestone deposit upon the very dark earth, looking just like an egg in an egg cup. From the ceiling of the grotto, drops fell with regularity against its delicate upper part of a blinding white. Within that luminosity seemed to dwell the very apotheosis of those wonderful Prince Rupert's drops. It was almost unsettling to watch such a marvel forming. In another grotto, the grotto of the fairies near Montpellier, you walk between high quartz walls, your heart stopping a few seconds at the spectacle of this gigantic mineral overlay called the imperial mantle, whose drapery forever defies that of any statuary, covered with roses by a spotlight's beams, so that it might become, even in this way, quite as dazzling as the splendid and convulsive cloak made of the infinite repetition of a unique little red feather of a rare bird that the ancient Hawaiian chieftains used to wear. But it is completely apart from these accidental figurations that I am led to compose a eulogy to crystal. There could be no higher artistic teaching than that of the crystal. The work of art, just like any fragment of human life considered in its deepest meaning, seems to me devoid of value if it does not offer the hardness, the rigidity, the regularity, the luster in every interior and exterior facet of the crystal. Please understand that this affirmation is constantly and categorically opposed for me to everything that attempts, aesthetically or morally, to found formal beauty on a willed work of voluntary perfection that humans most desire to do. On the contrary, I have never stopped advocating creation, spontaneous action, insofar as the crystal, non-perfectible by definition, is the perfect example of it. The house where I live, my life, what I write, I dream that all that might appear from far off, like these cubes of rock salt look close up. So we have also one of the wonderful things about this book is that it's got photographs. So it's got the house of rock crystal. We'll see it's relating these two things that seem to be opposites, the crystal and the coral reef. And here, the fixed explosive. This is the photo. Of the dancer in motion. Right, so these are his examples. Okay, so this is what we don't normally think of. When we think of the crystal, we think of its mathematical regularity. We see it as like an expression of a molecular form, just sort of accreted. We see it almost like fractally, that it's the same in macro as it is in micro. But in fact, crystals grow through slight variation in imperfection. So what defines a crystal is not just the regularity of the geometrical principles of its chemical structure, but also its circumstance that cause it to not fit that pattern exactly. And it's something that takes like thousands of years to form. Right, so it takes a very long time to form. And similarly, not a great photo, but anyway, the coral reef. The coral reef, as the form is the product of millions of little animals leaving little mineral deposits. So they're crustaceans that build little homes for themselves, and it grows that way. So it grows both organically, spontaneously, but takes on a kind of pattern, but also has a random factor in the pattern. Right, so you can recognize different species of coral based on observable patterns, but no coral reef is exactly the same as any other, even if the same species of coral, just like no crystal is the same as any other. Like gemstones, right, are defined by their flaws, right? So like a diamond without flaws is not as beautiful because it kind of loses something, right? So flaws are essential to the beauty of the diamond and the crystal. Right, so it's the product of two things at once. It's the product of a kind of regularity and randomness. It's also the product of a slow process and a kind of spontaneous, like a slow, almost imperceptible process and a spontaneous accident. Okay, so let me turn to, that's just the opening bit. Let's turn to the notes that you guys. So he starts off with the love object. Moves to the notion of convulsive beauty, and then gives as his example the crystal, the coral reef, and the fixed explosive. And although his first example we should keep in mind, especially for later with Benjamin, of the locomotive derailed in the forest and overgrown. Right, so let me just say something about that. So we're going to have in the final week, we'll read the Paralipomena too on the concept of history, where Benjamin says Marx thinks that revolution is the locomotive of history, but maybe revolution is rather the people on the train pulling the emergency brake. And of course, it would be both. Of course, it would be both. And so that would be the kind of contradiction or thesis antithesis that Breton is trying to evoke there. Now, we've dealt with critical reification, the idea of critical reification, art as critical reification. So that it is not just the objectification, but the reifying of that objectification that Benjamin found in common between Brecht and Kafka, and also Proust, like Proustian memory, the contradiction between voluntary and involuntary memory. Right, is freedom in the voluntary memory, or is freedom in the involuntary memory? Is it in the intentional, or is it in the spontaneous and accidental? Now, what you guys should know about the Surrealists is that one of the things that they do is they try to come up with aleatory procedures for making art, like randomizers. Right, so they try different experiments with how to produce art randomly. And so the question is not the randomness, but rather how we make sense of the random. Right, so it's this kind of intentional and unintentional contradiction. We read the Baudelaire, the dedication to his publisher, where he said, he's not sure that he's produced anything, let alone what it is. So he's not sure that he produced anything at all, let alone what it might be, and that other people might delight in that happy accident, but that he feels humiliated as a poet because he thinks the ideal for the poet is to produce exactly what he intends. And of course, that's a little bit of a paradoxical statement that he's making. Now, shock, we've had the shock effect, the traumatophilic, the shock. So the interesting thing about the traumatophilic and the shock, the attraction to the shocking. We're also going to be dealing with déjà vu, the Freudian interpretation of déjà vu, the feeling of déjà vu. So the thing with shock is to be like a traumatophile, to sort of be attracted to shock, is actually to try to avoid the shock. Right, so you're trying to turn something that happens to you into your own intended, willed happening. Yeah, well, of course, to also to turn into a thing, which also diminishes it, its power, but also to turn something that was involuntary into something voluntary. So, to be attracted to shocking things is to try to avoid the shock of shocking things. Now, déjà vu. So when we have the experience of déjà vu, according to Freud, we are experiencing something new. We are. And we are feeling unconsciously like we're being overwhelmed, but our mind plays a trick on us and turns the new overwhelming thing into something familiar. So you have the feeling of having experienced something before, actually as a defense against the new thing that's happening that's overwhelming you. So it's like an unconscious trick that's played on you where you, rather than be overwhelmed, experience like a dissociative state or a psychotic break. Instead, your unconscious gives you the illusion that you've experienced it before. And again, we have the feeling of déjà vu in ordinary life. So it's not like something really dramatic consciously has to happen. rather it's something that is happening unconsciously, or we're not even aware of what it is that is new and overwhelming to us. So we're going to see that the already seen, déjà vu, and the jamais vu, the never seen. Right, so that's going to be the contradiction that Breton sets up later with the found object. So something that you've never seen before that nonetheless seems to satisfy a desire, but it's a desire you didn't know that you had. And it's like the object that you didn't know that you were looking for, but you were looking for. And therefore it's something completely new and unexpected that at the same time feels like familiar.
So where do you locate shock in Breton's narrative? Is it in the convulsive beauty? Do you think Breton is like a trauma file?
Yeah. If we keep in mind what we've established from Baudelaire and treat Breton as like a little Baudelarian case or another Baudelarian subject, and we should always keep in mind, so we're talking about these particular characters, we're talking about these particular writers, Baudelaire and Breton, and they have their own biographies and psychologies and whatnot. Nonetheless, Baudelaire is a classic because he somehow resonates with us. And Breton, Surrealism is, canonized. And Breton, he's describing something very specific to him. Like, we definitely get a sense of his particular personality. But we can also generalize from it. And of course, in writing this, in making art, in writing things like the piece that we were looking at today, obviously, the particular is becoming universal, meaning like we kind of know what he's talking about. We kind of can identify with it. All right, so it's very specific, and yet also something that can be shared, something that can be communicated, something that can be described. So the shock issue is tricky, right? Because on the one hand, we have all of our shocking experiences very early in life before we even remember anything. So everything that happens subsequently is not really shocking the way our earliest experiences were, at least according to Freud, but rather what's shocking about it is how they recall those early experiences. But they recall those earlier experiences in a way that we can make sense of. Right, so the only question for Freud is how regressive it makes us. In other words, if we have a psychotic break, if we have a total disorganization of our personality, what that's doing is bring you back to like a very early infantile state. And not actually to that infantile state, but to what you recall of that state.
So the fleeing woman or the object heard you like restages the trauma of the denial of the breast or something? Is that?
Sure. Or just the object. Like, we can, we put it in the oral phase because that's the earliest phase. And also because Freud, wants to emphasize that we don't experience the other as they really are, but only in a kind of version of what they are. And so by saying it's like the breast, right? It's like just to remind us that like the infant doesn't experience people as people. They don't experience themselves as a person, right? It's not to emphasize the body part. It's to sort of again defamiliarize us from what we might project back into the psychology of the infant. I was thinking about this on the way down here, about like surrealism, and again, surrealism being more real than reality. Like, how do we actually experience reality, in fact? Meaning, at a conscious level, we have a very organized experience of reality. We kind of, have a kind of hierarchy of meaning. We have an ordered and regulated and kind of filtered view of things. But at an unconscious level, it's more like, it's even more radical than like a dream state in terms of like how we associate things, how we kind of bring things together. In our unconscious mind, it doesn't have to follow those rules, right? The sort of more kind of conscious and kind of culturally recognizable, linguistically describable. No, the idea is that's not the actual reality that we're living in. So, rather we're associating things in all sorts of ways. We're making sense of things in all sorts of ways. That are more about feeling and images, not about like concepts and words and cultural tropes. But again, that's mostly happening unconsciously. Might be happening at the threshold of consciousness. Here's another point. So I mentioned Surrealism. So Surrealism is an art movement. However, all art movements, their central concepts are meant to be generalizable. In other words, it's not like, okay, we're doing this instead of that. Rather, the idea is the Surrealist movement in art and literature is meant to describe how all art and all literature is surrealist. The cave painting is a surrealist work of art. Right. Holy Scripture is surrealist, and it definitely is. Right, it definitely is. So everything is understood. In other words, the concept of surrealism applies to literally everything. It's not like, be a surrealist as opposed to something else. It's rather, wake up people to the fact that everything is surrealist and always has been. Right, so religious rituals are surrealist, all artworks are surrealist, all literature is surrealist. Our minds are surrealist. Reality itself is surrealist. Right, so that's the point. Like the point of surrealism is that they've intuited something about the nature of reality itself. And that their art is meant to sort of bring out this aspect of reality that is there, but that we may not notice. Or we might have become numb to, or something, or naturalized, or culturally kind of assimilated in a kind of false way. Whereas the point is to recognize this aspect of reality.
And I feel like what this is getting at is like that is like actually our deepest desire is to be like reminded of that. The exhaustion of like organizing all of these thoughts all the time, like the object, whatever it is, whether it's like the spoon with the shoe on it, like that serves to kind of like reconstellate some things.
Yep.
And like we are kind of like the mad love is like we are like a madness like drawn to that disorganization over and over and over again.
Yeah, let me say something about this. Why they glom onto surrealism? Psychoanalysis the way that they do. Again, Freud has his famous title of a book, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. Of course, Interpretation of Dreams, one of the most widely read writings by Freud, popularly. And for Freud, the pathological is just an extreme version of the normal. Right? So the idea is that the neurotic and even the psychotic is like a key to the more normal, the ordinary, the more common. Right, so they love that idea. That, you know, again, it's not a difference of kind, but of degree. Right, so everyone is more or less neurotic, everyone is more or less psychotic. We'll see what Benjamin has to say about this next week in the Surrealism essay.
Sorry, can you repeat that idea again? The pathological is what?
An extreme version of the ordinary.
Like when you read, for instance, like this quote that I'm profoundly persuaded that any perception registered in the most involuntary way bears in itself the solution, symbolic or other, of a problem you have with yourself. Yeah, like what we particularly talked about. Yeah, but how were surrealists combining their political awareness with this problem that you have with yourself, with this kind of, I know, narcissistic
Definitely.
focus that they have?
Well, so he introduces, the reason that I read out that opening section to the point that I did was to try to get all the sort of core ideas in motion, even though he's going to bring up other ideas and other examples. So notice he immediately associates like the commodity relations of like bourgeois society and capitalism to erotic life. Right, so, you know, it is just a function of that, right? So, and that there's a kind of, he's setting up a kind of, again, contradiction between the particular and the universal, which when we talked about the commodity form, I mentioned that the commodity combines these things, the qualitative and the quantitative, the particular and the universal, the abstract and the concrete, right? Use value and exchange value, the incommensurable and the commensurable. And that's what makes the commodity form so powerful, is that it can combine these things, it can hold these things together. Now, of course, we experience it rather as antinomical, meaning part of the point of like the Marxist approach to this is that the commodity form of social relations, namely our cosmology, our practical relations with everything and everyone, is in crisis and coming apart. It's disintegrating. Which means that we think that we have to choose between the qualitative and the quantitative, between the particular and the universal. And we reify these things. So we have particularism and universalism, rather than understanding that these things don't make any sense apart from the other. Right? So we're like, oh, capitalism quantifies, and it's kind of it's universalism, and it's abstract, and we want the particular, the concrete, the qualitative, as opposed to the commodification that universalizes and homogenizes and quantifies. We want what's different. And it's like, yeah, but actually none of that makes sense without the other side of it. And so we have to think about why we feel like we have to choose between the two, in a way that ancient peoples, including and all the way up through bourgeois emancipation, bourgeois philosophy like Kant and Hegel, they would never have thought you can choose the particular over the universal or the universal over the particular. That would never, it just doesn't make sense. Except it does make sense to us. So why does it make sense to us? Because capitalism. Remember I said the answer to every question is capitalism? Right, it's like the church lady. Could it be Satan? Could it be capitalism? Meaning, again, we have to denaturalize what spontaneously seems to make sense to us, which is this apparent stark opposition, flat opposition. You're particular, you're interested in the particular, or you're interested in the universal. No. And again, like, people didn't have that conception for tens of thousands of years, and hopefully we'll get past this. right? Hopefully we will get past this antinomical view that we have. And of course we already do. Like we have just other ways of associating the particular and universal, which is where the surrealists come in. In other words, on the one hand, he says we feel like we're under the weight of a malediction, so we feel like we've been cursed, right? So we feel like, oh, do I really love my lover, or is my lover just an example of a type that I have, right? And this kind of like, do I really care about the other, or is it just a projection of myself? And it's like, well, of course the other's a projection of yourself, of course, but also they are another too, right? But no, we're like, it's like one or the other. Do you love me or do you only love yourself? It's like, but we've never been like, we don't exist alone. Like, in other words, all this whole psychology of relation, it's always been in relation to others. We've never existed without others. We can feel like we have and can exist without others, but in fact, no, that's never been the case. It will never be the case. So the only question is, how do we relate to others? How do we relate to the otherness of the other? What have you? So the narcissism, that's where it brings in the narcissism. So narcissism, there's primary narcissism, there's original narcissism. In other words, there's the child before they know that there are others, namely the infant. But that both subsists and is transcended, meaning that's gone. So then what do we feel instead? We feel abandoned, or we feel bereft, or we feel isolated or atomized, we feel cut off. It's not like we can ever return to that original narcissism. Now, I think that we talked about this when we did the Morning of Melancholy. Did we talk about the myth of Narcissus?
Yeah.
The Greek myth, yeah. So the thing with the myth of Narcissus is that Narcissus is not like, it's not that he loves himself too much. It's that he's not a self at all. And others are not others, right? That's the point, is that there's an indifference. It's not excessive self-love, because actually it's not love at all. And then he's cursed by Aphrodite to fall in love. And he falls in love with his own reflection in a pool, falls in and dies. But it's not that he loves himself and not the other. It's that there's no love of either self or other. There's no love. There's no eros. Eros is about sexuality. Sexuality is about combining things. That's what the word means in Latin. Like, it's about others, self and other. It's about that. So, and the point is, we only have a sense of self by virtue of our relations to others. Meaning it's our parents who give us a sense of ourselves. We would not have a sense of ourselves otherwise, according to Freud. There would be no self if there was no other. There would be no subject without an object. There is no subject without an object. There's no self without another. No. There would just be indifference. There would just be existence. There would be no identity. So the only question is how? How do we get our sense of self from our relation to others? How are we relating to others, which speaks to how we are relating to ourselves? Where does our sense of self come from? And again, radically, and Bataille definitely went there, by the way, more so than Breton, radically recognizing that our fundamental experience of ourself and of others changes historically. Changes historically, is culturally distinct. It's historically distinct. We didn't always have this sense of ourselves and of others because we didn't always relate to ourselves and to others the way we do now. That would be the idea. All right. right? So, and a bourgeois psychology, we could say, is in crisis in capitalism. Because bourgeois psychology comes from bourgeois social relations, which are in crisis in capitalism. So we have this kind of what Breton calls the malediction. We feel like we're cursed because we're both bourgeois subjects and can't be bourgeois subjects in capitalism. We are and are not. So I mentioned both and neither. Also is and is not. Dialectics. Is and is not at the same time. Both is and is not at the same time. Which of course then makes people think, well, we want to do something else. We want to get out of this dialectical madhouse. And we want to, what's the stuff that they take in South America? The rich
Yes.
people? Yeah, exactly. We want to like trip out and, you know, have like, you know, experiences that transcend and blah, blah, blah. You know, that's fine. But no, it's us as subjects of capitalism that want that. So even wanting that and what that is specific to us as subjects in capitalism. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
It's just I feel like I don't understand like half of this. Like Mad Love reminded me of Alain Badiou's writings on love. I don't know if you like in which he
I know
explains-
Badiou a bit, but not that.
But like he explains that love is like gives you like ontological access to the other and through the other to yourself. So it's like similar to this.
That sounds optimistic.
It is very optimistic.
Yeah.
The writings are very optimistic, actually. But I don't understand how like this like epistemological and ontological relation to erotics deals with Benjamin. And I know we're not there because there's probably next class.
Yeah, we're gonna have, yeah.
But like for now, I just don't know like where is Breton taking us with eroticism. Because I understand the concept, but I don't understand like why are we going this way.
Oh, well, okay, so Baudelaire already introduced the psychology of the commodity, we might say, and also the erotics of the commodity. And so this should not be unfamiliar to us, the Breton, although Breton is, you know, both following from that and further elaborating on it. And also he's introducing time and memory in a way that Baudelaire did not thematize the same way. In other words, with Baudelaire, we had sort of like images. Yeah, we have these images, and then on some motifs in Baudelaire, Benjamin tied Proust back in. And so, you know, I don't know if I used this metaphor with you guys before, and now that we're in the Tesla world or the EV world, it's kind of this is going to be a lost metaphor soon. The internal combustion engine, the pistons firing, right? So now at this point in the course, all pistons are firing, right? So we got the Brecht piston and the Kafka piston and the Proust piston and the Baudelaire piston. They're all firing, and it's all wonderful orchestra, right? So we have to keep everything in play, right? We have to be juggling all these balls at the same time. And you know, we've been building up to the point where we can, you know, bring ourselves into Benjamin's contemporary situation and how these things have been thematized by prior art and literature, especially literature. So we did Baudelaire out of order. We started with Proust, but then we kind of went back to the beginning, and then we have Benjamin on what Baudelaire meant to Proust. And so now that whole thing is in motion, we get Breton. as like a Proustian, Baudelarian, Kafkaesque, Brechtian. What am I leaving out? Right? And also as a Marxist. He's a Marxist. He's not like, he's a Freudian and a Hegelian and a Marxist in a way that neither Proust nor Baudelaire nor Kafka were. Brecht is, but we'll come back to Brecht. Because in fact, Brecht is an important interlocutor with Benjamin on what Marxism is. So that's how we're doing it. In other words, we're not kind of restarting our considerations with each author. And even though this is a weird piece of writing, right? This is like an autobiographical writing that is also like an art manifesto and seems to be some kind of weird critical theoretical commentary on capitalism, Breton.
Yeah.
And so it's not simply a work of literature by any means. Like what the hell is it? What is it really? Like Mad Love. I mean, it can be read as a manifesto. It can be read as like an art manifesto for sure, as like a self-understanding of art by an artist and also an advocacy for a certain kind of practice of art by an artist. But it's so much more than that, isn't it? Especially because he relates his own understanding and his own practice very explicitly to being a subject of contemporary capitalism. Right, so that's where we're going with it. We're doing a kind of like phenomenological. I mean, what I'd say about Badiou is I'm sure he read this. I'm sure he wrote Breton. No doubt, But also Badiou is in dialogue with like a whole history of philosophy and right. It's like, and so the one thing that I can say also about Badiou is that he's a Platonist. And Plato has this whole ancient ontology of love. Do you guys know what that is? That's the idea that God separated the soul. And so like erotic longing is about trying to find your separated half. And that is really what's behind that idea by Badiou, is which is different. In other words, that's different from the other as a commodity and the self as a commodity. That is different, right? It's different from finding your other half, which is an ancient Platonic idea, which speaks to a certain experience and a certain reality, but also steps to one side of our actual situation in capitalism, right? Which is that, again, our particular notion of self, our particular notion of other, or I should say our specific notion of self, specific notion of other, and our specific psychology of it. Because again, the Marxist idea would be that Plato's psychology was entirely different from ours.
What did you say that first time?
Plato's psychology was entirely different from ours. Meaning, Plato probably didn't have a conflict between the conscious and the unconscious the way we do.
So then I have like another question. It's like, so in this eroticism, we see the other as commodity, and we experience commodity through shock in a way.
We experience the crisis of the commodity as a shock. Like in other words,
exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we get a reified commodity, and the shock is the sort of
And how do you get it back? Like, how do we access convulsive love?
Okay, so that would be the found object. That would be this found object procedure.
Like the crystal?
Well, the crystal is meant to be like a principle that describes like why the found object can have the power that it has. Right, so the found object has the character of the crystal or of the fixed explosive or of the decontextualized, recontextualized, like defamiliarized, estrangement effect, alienation effect. So, yeah, I mean, that's really the central category of the whole work is the found object, or the lost object, found object, like the whole thing. Yeah.
Do we bridge it to correspondences?
Yes. Right. So correspondences would be this association that seems to cut against the ordinary associations, and yet also seems to be real. Right? I mean, what I mentioned earlier about the uncanny. So the uncanny is the sudden sense, according to Freud, the uncanny is the sudden sense that something that is familiar feels unfamiliar and feels mysterious. Now again, we could psychologize this, right? We could. But we're trying to get a perspective on the psychology. In other words, we're trying to say, okay, what's the situation that's producing this psychology? Rather than just saying, okay, we know what psychology is and we're just going to interpret things psychologically. It's but how do we interpret psychology itself?
Can nihilism as the political spirit include love? It's to me they seem like opposites, but here we're trying to build this relation, right? Because Benjamin says that nihilism is, I forget exactly.
The method.
Yeah, the method, thank you, of the political struggle, right? And now we're looking at this kind of compulsive love and trying to retrieve shock, but everything's reified. So how is this method of nihilism include love?
All right, so here's the thing. So, and we're going to see what Benjamin does with religion, which is to say, Breton says love is a passion. So what does that mean? It means a form of suffering. And I mentioned the Nietzschean bit, so obviously Benjamin is Nietzschean, but also Nietzsche's running around in the background with the Surrealists. And even though it takes an unfortunate character of this kind of polarization within Surrealism and factionalism, like the Hegelians versus the Nietzscheans, whatever. And but both think of themselves as Marxist, right? So it's is to be a Marxist you need to be more Nietzschean, or do you be a Marxist you need to be more Hegelian? And even that opposition is very unfortunate. It's very 20th century to oppose Nietzsche and Hegel. They're not really opposed to each other, and certainly not for Benjamin. And also not for, I mentioned Trotsky. Trotsky also has this kind of thing about Freud and Nietzsche that otherwise the Stalinists reject Freud and Nietzsche entirely, and he's just yeah, but actually it's completely compatible with Marxism, and Marxism can explain Nietzsche and Freud. Anyway, so where was I going with that? Passion. Nietzsche. Life is about the suffering we choose and why we choose the suffering that we choose. In other words, it's not about the absence of suffering or the avoidance of suffering. So love is not about not suffering. Love is about suffering. And of course, I mentioned religion. So Christianity, the passion, right? Jesus' crucifixion is an act of love. Love is a crucifixion. You just choose which cross you're going to be crucified on. You don't choose not to be crucified. Because to choose not to be crucified would mean choosing not to live, which we might do. Meaning capitalism also gives us that option, which is that we can try to avoid living in order to try to avoid suffering. But no, to live is to suffer. The only question is the meaning of the suffering. The meaning of the suffering. So now nihilism is a little bit different. So nihilism is more like the nihilism that Benjamin brought in was very particular. It's about politics not being about happiness or about morality. It's about freedom, and that from the standpoint of happiness or morality, freedom seems to be nihilistic. Right, so it's the pursuit of happiness, it's not a happiness. So freedom is the pursuit of happiness, freedom is not happiness. Indeed, freedom is suffering. Right, so, and it's also Rousseauian and Kantian and Hegelian and Marxist ideas, which is that we suffer as animals, we are animals, so we suffer the way the animals suffer, but we also suffer in a way that the animals do not suffer. In other words, we choose our own suffering. The animals do not. The animals suffer. But we suffer as animals, and then on top of that, we choose our suffering. As a species, right? Individually, whatever.
Even if we transcend capitalism?
Yeah.
Like our ontological base is just suffering, like completely existentialist. So
To live in society.
Capitalist society just chooses a new form of freedom that is still suffering, but maybe less suffering than before.
Different suffering.
Just different.
Different suffering than before. Different suffering. So in other words, what we do is and this is the Rose and the Cross. This is Hegel, right? This is like history is the slaughter bench. History is the charnel house. So it's progress in consciousness of freedom that is the meaning of all the sacrifices that have been brought onto the broad altar of history. Right, so, yeah, freedom, and by the way, this is also a Christian idea, and I don't know if it's a Judeo-Christian idea. I guess it is a Judeo-Christian idea, although I've heard that Jews don't believe in original sin anymore. I don't see how that's possible, because there's still Adam and Eve expelled from Eden, right, so that the original sin is still there. To live is to suffer. That's been true since we were expelled from paradise. That's the passion. And also, do we know that Jesus is God? Why? Because God made himself a man in order to understand human suffering and in order to forgive us of our original sin. Right, so in other words, we're going to suffer. The only question is how we're going to suffer. And finding the meaning in suffering. So you could say human history is the story of humans choosing new forms of suffering and finding the meaning in that suffering, and that's the meaning of human existence. Yeah, so why do we have to overcome capitalism? Because this form of suffering has gotten old. It's old. It's gotten old. Like, we're really just going to suffer like this forever? Did we get enough out of this capitalist suffering? We've squeezed it for all it's worth, I think, at this point. You know, running out of, like, the meaning of capitalist suffering. You kind of ran out of it with Baudelaire. We were, like, again, Benjamin's idea is that pretty much, what was it that Baudelaire said? Squeezing, like the old lecher goes to an old whore and squeezes her breast like a stale orange. Like, we got the last bit of juice out of that orange. We got our last life out of capitalism in the mid-19th century. We've been doing the same thing ever since then. And if it wasn't immediately old the first time around, it was old the second time around. Surrealists. And we're not even doing that anymore. Nobody's writing what Breton is writing. Nobody's writing this. Nobody's doing this. We're not doing this. We're not producing anything new anymore. Sorry to say. Okay, so how should we got Rex notes, we got Jack notes. Those are only 2 sets of notes. That's what it's supposed to be. So who should we start with? Did you guys coordinate it all?
What?
Rex, Jack?
I can start, it doesn't matter.
Okay, cool.
Let me just pull them up so I can read things too far away.
Oh, we might be due for a break. Hold on.
Yeah, I think so.
We're due for a break. So I don't know if Pablo, if I answered your question. Like, what are we doing with Breton? I think that the word that I said was phenomenological. Like, we're doing a kind of. Breton's providing some kind of phenomenology.
Of love.
Well, of experience, if we've had this category,
Just
right?
pure phenomenon.
Well, no. I mean, what I would say is that he's thematizing, like, he's sort of turning it into the question of the object of love, and then what kind of object is the object of love, and the idea that the object of love is the found object, is a found object, right? So, and what that says about the subjective experience. Right, so that's what I meant by phenomenology, meaning, and a self-understanding of it. So he's not just giving us an account of his experience, but he's also trying to analyze and understand it. He's got a theory, we might say. Yeah, it's a case. It's a case study.
Pretty much like with
Proust.
Baudelaire.
Proust and Baudelaire and Kafka. And Brecht a little bit less so, though we looked at the most sort of self-consciously quasi-autobiographical bohemian Brecht rather than the Brecht that hides behind the political mask. His later plays are more like hiding behind the political mask. We got more raw Brecht with Paul.
You just wanted to like touch on the notes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So kind of like events and happenings are somehow like preordained and everything happens for a reason, and then connecting Freud obviously to surrealism and desire and the subconscious, it just made me also think about like when he was writing this, and like if science or things can explain these mysteries of circumstance in life in a scientific, reasonable way. That was my question. Also, obviously, throughout this book,
As opposed to Freud?
as opposed to Freud, like
No, Freud's
like,
very
is,
reasonable.
Like with sort of physics, or is it really
Physics?
explained, or is it a mystery?
Okay, so check this out. For the surrealists, science is surrealist.
Okay.
Because it is. Right? Physics is surrealist. For sure. Right? Like, I beat this dead horse, but I'm going to beat it again. The Bergson-Einstein. Right? Einstein said what you philosophers call time, we physicists know doesn't really exist. So Breton's in the audience, and he's like, exactly, my man, surrealism. Right? He's like, Bergson, he's too traditional philosopher. Einstein is surrealist. Definitely. Yeah, for sure. Right? And did I mention the crazy movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once? Did you guys see that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once? Right? So that's like some kind of like quantum relativity, something or other. Right? And it's a fun movie. It's like surrealist, I guess. They become pet rocks, the mother and daughter on the cliff. Right? It's a cool movie. It's interesting. Because the millennial daughter is collapsing all of time and space. Because she's like nihilist, because she ate the everything bagel.
Yes.
The everything bagel. So don't eat the everything bagel, because after you eat the everything bagel, then nothing is left to experience and life becomes meaningless. And the everything bagel is like the actual rebus of the universe, of like space and time folding in on itself. So it's like the singularity, right? It's a cute movie.
I loved it.
Yeah. Who's the director? I feel like he's one of these directors. No?
It's the two Davids.
Uh-huh. Because Yeah, so it's like, it's in that style. Yeah, it's a funny, but anyway, reasonably explained. The question is, what are we trying to explain? And I guess we should stick with Kant on this one, explaining the subject. I think that the notion that we have of science is that science is not the subject or something, that like objective knowledge. But that's why for Breton, science would be surrealist. Because it would be about like more real than real. You know, it would be like the objectivity of reality, which like underlies our. No, Freud was trying to be scientific. He was. He was scientific, I can say. Habermas, do you guys know who Jürgen Habermas is? So he's the second generation Frankfurt School. There's an essay by his that I teach on Freud, where he says that not only is Freud scientific, but Freud might be the only scientific theory that's ever happened. Why? No, why? Because the criterion of science is self-reflexivity. It's Wissenschaft. It's the German idea of science, which is science is knowledge that can explain its own condition of possibility. So it's a kind of Kantian, Hegelian notion of science. So basically, Freud is the only scientific observation of psychology because it's the only observation of psychology that can explain itself. That doesn't pretend to be outside the thing that it's explaining. And yet that's our common notion of science. Like scientific objectivity is from like a non-existent perspective. I'm trying to think of whether we'll encounter this. We're going to read some Nietzsche later. And we're anticipating a lot. Subjective versus objective truth. How can you separate those? And if we do, what does that indicate? What's that a symptom of? Okay, Rex. So circumstantial magical, just flesh that out a little bit. So what's the contradiction that's articulated there? I think
it's basically saying there's like a chain of events that equal something, but there's no way to explain that that's mysterious.
Right. So circumstantial would be like, yeah, everything happens for a reason, meaning everything is determined. And then like magical means, oh, suddenly you can't explain. Right. So everything is due to circumstances, and yet what about these things that don't appear to be due to circumstances? Right. So what that's meant to do is change our sense of what we think the circumstances are. Right, so that's the objective chance idea. Right, so what is unconscious becomes conscious. It's like revealed through the object. Right, so like, I guess you're thinking that this is not reasonable or scientific because is it magical thinking? I don't know.
I was thinking of like chaos theory and stuff, how like one thing happens, right? So it was kind of like trying to explain chaos and circumstance with something kind of grounded, I guess. But
Okay.
I did Google it, and just because I was curious, but there is some kind of physics theory in physics that tries to make sense of this idea. But I don't understand physics all that well, so.
Chaos theory.
That's not what came up, but it is also made me think of chaos theory.
Mm-hmm. Right, so what we're talking about is the intentional versus the accidental, and how the accidental becomes intentional. So, a little Hegelianism. let me bring in a little Hegel here, which is that Hegel thinks that everything that happens, even the accidental, the random, becomes necessary in retrospect. So from the standpoint of the present, everything that happened in the past had to have happened, because it did happen. In other words, it made us what we are, and therefore has a necessity to it, because it speaks to the necessity of our existence. And we do exist, and so, therefore, what happened was necessary. Now, of course, this is painful for us to think. This is painful for us to think, because we don't feel necessary, we feel accidental. We feel unnecessary. So the only question is, how did people think of necessity before? How did the notion of necessity change? And then why would we feel like existence is unnecessary now? So if for tens of thousands of years, humans always thought that everything existed with necessity. So everything existed necessarily. Existence was necessary. Now we have a hard time explaining the necessity of existence. And so I was going to say about like chaos theory and this kind of stuff. From a Marxist perspective, the problems that science raises now are due to capitalism. There's no science outside of capitalism. There's nothing outside of capitalism. So the science that we have now is the science of capitalism, which means that the problems it sets itself and how it tries to address those problems are symptomatic of capitalism. So getting beyond capitalism is going to be getting beyond, make a qualitative transformation in the way we understand science now. So, which is a bizarre thought, granted, and yet is a necessary thought. Meaning, why should we assume that the science we have now is somehow unaffected by capitalism? And not only unaffected, but somehow independent of? How would that be? You know, we have the science that we need as capitalism necessitates it. Remember what Valerie wrote in the beginning of the work of art essay? We read that? Yes, neither space, nor time, nor matter, nor energy are what they used to be. And I said, that's not a metaphor, that's not figurative, that's literally true. So these things are different than they used to be. Of course, our science, our scientific understanding, our investigation into these things is different. And will be different again. And will be different again. In other words, at some point beyond capitalism in the future, we will look back at the physics that we practice today, and we'll be amazed that people ever thought those things. And we'll be like, oh, how funny and superstitious they used to be. Einstein will one day seem like a witch doctor. He'll seem like a kind of saint, like a kind of magical thinking, kind of inspired savant. With some intuition that kind of grasp things, but kind of grasp things in a mystified way. And now we understand better. That would be the idea. Anyway, the idea is that we're going to get, if we get beyond capitalism, we're going to get beyond everything. And we're going to get beyond our notion of science that we have now too. Okay. But Breton, yeah, he's not dealing with physics exactly. All right. Symbolism. All right, so I think that I mentioned in the past that symbolism, we have to be careful with these terms. So symbol literally means like mash up, like two things combined. Like that's what a symbol is. So Freudian symbolism, like psychoanalytic symbolism, psychological symbolism in the psychoanalytic sense, is it's combination of conscious and unconscious. Right, so it's an association. It's an unconscious association that takes a conscious form. All right, so another way of thinking about it is something is symbolically important for Freud when we feel that it's meaningful, but we can't explain why. Yeah, that would be like a correspondence as well. That's right. Yeah. The thing with correspondence is, did we look at that poem by Baudelaire in class? We might not have. I think that it's in the readings that we had, but it wasn't, I don't think we talked about it in class, but since it's come up a couple of times, let's look at it.
Did you say for Freud something is symbolic when we feel it's meaningful but don't know why?
Yes. Meaning consciously we're aware that we find it significant, but we're unaware of the unconscious meaning, like the reason for its significance. Right. So that would be the idea, is that we repress the reason for its significance. So it is significant, but we don't know why. I thought we had the 1855. Did we have? Oh, no, we don't. Did we not? We had the correspondences, I thought. It's like the beginning of a selection of his art writings.
But isn't it like a line? Like
It's a poem.
Yeah, it's like the second poem, but isn't it like if you search there?
thefloordumal.org. Let's see if we get a good translation now.
Yes, because this page has like multiple.
It does, so I want to find the one that I like. Oh yeah, maybe, did we do this one? I don't know if we did talk about it, okay, so we did, all right. So we read the whole thing. Yeah, because, so, wait, the forest grove of symbols and the familiar glances. Yes, okay, we did. I remember this now. Okay, fine. Sorry. I wasn't sure whether we had done justice to it. So, again, we're unaware of the significance of the mashup. So there is a mashup, there is a combination of things, there's an association, but we don't know the origin of that association. That would be the psychoanalytic. So there's a conscious association that happens for an unconscious reason. So we're aware of, like, we wake up from a dream, we remember the images in the dream, we're conscious of the images, but we're not conscious of their motivation. So the found object has this character. Right, so the slipper spoon, let's start with that. Well, we get these. We get the Chuck and the with the mask, the slipper spoon. Okay, let's set the stage. So, it's him and Giacometti, right? They're going to the flea market. Is that who is? Yeah, his bud is. Okay, so the flea market. We talked about commodities. So commodities have use value and exchange value. So, and the main commodity is labor power as a commodity, and labor time as a measure of value. So labor in its two dimensions, use value and exchange value. But let's think about the articles of consumption. So I think that I mentioned that labor has two products. It has the article of consumption, and it has the social relation. Okay, so let's stick with the article of consumption. So it's useful to someone in some way, and it is exchangeable in its value. So it realizes its value, according to Marx, in the circuit of production and consumption. So consumption means the realization of the exchange value and the use value. And the main point of use values is to reproduce labor. Right? So it's subsistence goods. So before bourgeois society, objects of trade were not subsistence goods for ordinary people. They were luxury goods for the ruling classes. Why? Because most people were farmers and they were immediately providing for their own needs. In bourgeois society, we get our subsistence goods through exchange. We don't produce what we eat. No one does, in fact. Like literally no one in the world anymore subsists on their local production. Everybody depends on things produced elsewhere to live. Okay, so that's the immediate circuit. We had the rag picker, the rag picker's wine. So we've already encountered this idea of a second life for commodities, for objects of consumption. Of course, that's what a flea market is. So a flea market is something that has already realized its use value and its exchange value, and now has a second life. So it's dropped out of use and it's dropped out of exchange. But it's now taking on a second life of use and exchange. So flea market, people buy and sell things, and they're getting something after it's already outlived its original use value. So they're a peculiar kind of commodity. It's kind of the afterlife of the commodity, the afterlife of the article of consumption. Now there are a couple of things. So we talked about like the lover and beloved as subject and object of the commodity. So we have that going on. We also have the artwork. So the artwork is a commodity, but it's a peculiar kind of commodity. And what would it mean to treat the artwork as a second-hand commodity? Or as like a flea market item? Right, so remember that Baudelaire in his poetry, he has the rag picker as a analog, and he's got the prostitute as an analog. And so is art a kind of secondhand feeling? So the artist has an experience, and then they market that experience, and then it becomes a kind of secondhand or a kind of vicarious experience. So the artwork is a commodity, but it's also a specific kind of commodity because it's a commodity where its use value is its experience. And we read the Heroism of Modern Life into to the bourgeoisie, and he was talking about the utility of art, that we need art as like a recreational activity, as a leisure activity. We need it to refresh ourselves in order to go back to work and resume our labor. Right, so if most of our time is spent working, then we need art as like, kind of an essential activity for reproducing our labor power. But it's a peculiar kind of subsistence good, meaning what did he say, that we could live without bread but not without poetry? right? So we could go 3 days without bread, but we couldn't even go a single day without poetry. Right. So it's a peculiar kind of subsistence good. So it's not an ordinary subsistence good, but it is some kind of a subsistence good. We need art. So art is a necessity, but it's this peculiar kind of necessity. And that also production and consumption seem to be separated, meaning we enjoy art without understanding how it's made, right? And so it's not, you don't have to know how art is made to be able to enjoy it. It's like this funny kind of way of posing it. So, and you need like, there's like a science of enjoyment, basically. So art is about like high quality enjoyment. All right, so the random aleatory procedure of surrealism, how do you generate artworks? How do you generate experiences that are random, that you wouldn't have come up with consciously, deliberately, but you produce things that are nonetheless meaningful? Meaning you produce something random that seems like it was meant to happen. So they're playing one of their games. Like going to the flea market is playing a surrealist game. It's another art procedure. It's like, let's see what random thing we find at the flea market, that it will be a random thing, but it will be something that we were meant to find. It will be necessary that we find this thing at the flea market.
So thrifting is surrealist.
Yeah, kind of. But not right. So, but it's the usefulness of the useless thing. Right? So, are they going to use it as a spoon? Are they going to use it as a serving spoon? Right? Because that's what it seems to be. Or is it like just an ornamental thing? Like, what is it? Like, it's like ornamental and useful? Right? So, meaning to be useful, did it really need to have that little boot? Which he thinks is like a sexy boot? Right? Like, it seems like it has a kind of superfluous character. Like, it could have just had like a little pedestal. But no. So why do humans do that? Why don't they just have a total functional object? Why do they put a little sexy boot there? Just to make life a little more interesting. Right? And yet, on the one hand, it's totally familiar. On the other hand, it's completely not. Meaning it's like, they experience it as if you could never have designed it. You could never have intentionally made it. Whereas obviously someone intentionally made it. Obviously someone designed it. So it's a folk art work? Like it's of peasant fabrication? But it's a surrealist artwork. It's a modernist, avant-garde artwork. So the two objects, we get the slipper spoon and we get the mask. Let's look at the mask. The mask is totally weird.
Isn't this like the same thing that the object-oriented ontologies do? Like attribute like this agency to objects in themselves? Like, because I know before you said like it was like not related to this, but when I'm reading this text specifically, he talks about like all the associations and all the forms of being and action that are in the object, and I think that's closer to Breton too.
Uh-huh.
Because he sees objects as like active, right? Like in action. So isn't this like the same thing?
Well, okay, so it's a little different. Or in some ways it's the opposite, which means it's the same thing. But it's the opposite. Which is to say that these, because they've fallen out of their original context of production and consumption, because they've lost their original use value and exchange value, actually they've lost their original action. So it literally is a second life. It's like an afterlife. And now the action is to be contemplated, right? Meaning these are useful things, like these are like practical objects that are now being contemplated, totally separated from their practical life. Meaning this is like a welder's mask or something, right? It's like to protect someone's face from some, activity that would otherwise be harmful. But now it's being considered as an aesthetic object. Right, so it is basically started out as a practical object that might have had some aesthetic qualities, but now it's been divorced from its practical use and turned into a total aesthetic object of contemplation. So it is an object divorced from its original action. So its action now is weird because it only acts on the imagination. Right. Whereas, let's see what he says here. He says, the objects that between the lassitude of some and the desire of others go off to dream at the antique fair had been just barely distinguishable from each other in the first hour of our stroll. They flowed by without accident, nourishing the meditation that this place arouses like no other, concerning the precarious fate of so many little human constructions. The first one of them that really attracted us, drawing us as something we had never seen, was a half mask of metal striking in its rigidity, as well as in its forceful adaptation to a necessity unknown to us. The first bizarre idea we had was that of being in the presence of a highly evolved descendant of the helmet, letting itself be drawn into a flirtation with the velvet mask. We were able, in trying it on, to convince ourselves that the eye holes, lined with horizontal strips of the same substance differently angled, permitted a perfect visibility above and below, as well as straight in front. The flatness of the actual face, outside of the nose, accentuated by the lines leading away, rapid and delicate to the temples, joined to a second compartmentalization of the site of strips perpendicular to the preceding ones and narrowing gradually, starting from the curve lent to the top of this blind face. The haughty attitude, sure of itself and unshakable, which had struck us from the start. Although the remarkably definitive character of this object seemed to escape the merchant, who urged us to buy it, suggesting we paint it in a bright color and use it as a lantern. Giacometti, usually very detached when it came to any thought of possessing such an object, put it down regretfully, seemed, as we walked along, to entertain some fear about its next destination, and finally retraced his steps to acquire it. So he was like, yeah, I don't want that. But then he's like, oh, but someone else might buy it. And so then he has to go back and get it. But so this is like, again, the metaphor would be like that this is like how we choose romantic partners. Yeah, exactly. That it's like, yeah, and then like someone else says, oh yeah, you could use it for that, and he's like, oh no, definitely not. And then he's like, but wait, oh no, someone else might get that girl's number. I need to go back. Some few boutiques later, I made just as elective a choice with a large wooden spoon of peasant fabrication, but quite beautiful, it seemed to me, and rather daring in its form, whose handle, when it rested on its convex part, rose from a little shoe that was part of it. I carried it off immediately. Right, so both are like narrated as if little erotic encounters, little erotic pickups. You know, like I passed on that one and then I thought again. And then I was like, I immediately carried it off. Right? So. We were debating about the meaning that should attach to such finds, no matter how trivial they might appear. The two objects which have been given with no wrapping, of whose existence we were ignorant some minutes before, and which imposed with themselves this abnormally prolonged sensorial contact, induced us to think ceaselessly of their concrete existence, offering to us certain very unexpected prolongations from their life. So it is that the mask, losing little by little what we had agreed on assigning it as a probable use, we first thought we were dealing with a German mask for saber fencing, tended to situate itself in the personal research of Giacometti, taking a place in it analogous to the one that the face of the statue I just spoke of occupied. Considering all the details of its structure, we decided that it was somehow included between the head reproduced in number 5 of the journal Minotaur, the last work he had finished and whose mold he had promised me, and this face, which had remained in a sketchy state. It seemed we sought to lift the last veil. The intervention of the mask seemed to be intended to help Giacometti overcome his indecision on this subject. The finding of an object serves here exactly the same purpose as the dream, in the sense that it frees the individual from paralyzing affective scruples, comforts him, and makes him understand that the obstacle he might have thought unsurmountable is clear. A certain plastic contradiction, undoubtedly a reflection of profound moral contradiction, observable in the first states of the sculpture, stemmed from the distinct manner in which the artist had treated the upper part. Yet this is all the discussion of this, the artwork. The mask, profiting from certain formal resemblances which might have caught our attention first, concerns the eye, the inevitable relation which can't be overlooked between the metallic trellis and the wheel. Imposes in its narrowest spatial limits the fusion of these two styles. It seems to me impossible to underestimate its role when I realize the perfect organic unity of this frail and imaginary body of the woman that we admire today. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. So reveals a need, or reveals a necessity, reveals a need that they were unaware of before. Right, so it's like you didn't know that you needed it until you found it. And it's the revelation, or what he calls the catalyzing role. Right, so it's the Cinderella slipper that creates the woman. Right, so it's like he's doing a kind of psychoanalytic interpretation of the Cinderella story, where it's not that she was wearing the slipper, but rather that the slipper made her, like created her. And this would be a Cinderella slipper for a non-existent woman, basically. The slipper spoon. want to come back to the end, but Jack, maybe you want to tell us what
Sure.
we've not addressed that you want to bring out?
I mean, we've addressed a lot of it. My first question is sort of related to, like, essentially what is the temporality of mad love and how can we connect it to Benjamin's messianic time? And then the next two questions sort of are playing around with the spoon and the mask and how they relate to, the commodity form. I think I was interested in this sort of like breakdown of the riddle images that Breton describes, where the slipper is the spoon, is the penis, and all this, and there's these magic, like wonderful transfigurations, and sort of if we apply that to the commodity form, sort of where does that take us? Because in the one thing, it seems like the object is losing its fixity. It's no longer a thing in the same way. There's this free play of associations, but also the fluidity of the meanings can kind of mirror the fetish character of the commodity. I think it's interesting that Lamba never speaks, basically. Like, he almost never describes her. She's like a non-person in that she is just completely an object of like his projected fantasy, and in a way that feels very amenable to commodities. There is no use value. Who she actually is, what she says, what she thinks is completely irrelevant to Breton. It's just this object that he chases through the night. And sort of, how do we fix that kind of chain of associations with the commodity form? And I guess also within that, sort of the urban experience of the trouvaille, how is that a very sort of symptomatic experience of walking through, which we touched on already, but walking through the flea market and finding this commodity that, feels like it's satisfying something, that's not something that exists. That's not an experience that exists before urban capitalism in this way. So pick up on that and what you will. And then the last two were just connections to Proust and Baudelaire.
All right, so on the temporality question, could you elaborate a little bit?
Well, I mean, we haven't really gotten the theses on history, so I feel like we're going to do a bad job at that. I was just struck on a purely the level of poetics and form in this, how temporality gets really interesting, especially in The Night of the Sunflower, how it speeds up and stops and jumps around. And then, of course, it seems when he does the weird rehashing of his poem line by line and saying how it's actually prophetic, it reminded me a lot of sort of Benjamin, I think at one point saying, at one point I had a list of everything that was important and I figured out all the questions, and then I lost it.
And then you lost it.
And Breton says it's basically the same thing. Okay? I wish I had that, but someone has it now and I can't get it back. So I just have to try to reconstruct it. So I think sort of just open-ended with Breton, mad love seems to be arresting, it seems to be immobilizing, but also at times it can speed things up and move sort of across time. You're able to have the prophetic poem that you wrote 10 years ago that anticipates your, one encounter in The Night of the Sunflower, and sort of whether Benjamin at his most sort of mystical, messianic, has any sort of shared sense of time.
And also so the end of the relationship that he describes also, it kind of was like he just skips kind of in a sense to when he's talking about the end, it's this whole relationship has happened, and I don't know, I thought that was really interesting how he describes sort of the end of this period of time, and then also, and just jumping around basically and then to the letter to the daughter from this affair that, and so, I don't know, it's just really interesting, kind of like how he was talking about slowing down and speeding up, and there isn't really it's not a really steady story, it's jumping and.
Right, so temporality, right, so things can take on a significance outside of the flow of time. That's one important point. The messianic time thing has to do with redemption. We looked at the theological political fragment. Okay, so, and we'll get there, but So the found object is getting a second value, getting a second life, and is redeeming itself in some way, like redeeming its existence. And so this model of like the experience of the beloved on the model of the found object is meant to be, I mean, this is going to sound super cheesy, and yet nonetheless it is exactly what he's saying, which is that, our existence in capitalism is, to work. And erotic life is like the like second life or redemption of what we ordinarily are. All right, so our primary life is to be bought and sold as commodities, to be produced as commodities and bought and sold as commodities.
So these objects are redeeming themselves because they stop being bought and used as commodities?
Well, that's the paradox. The paradox is that they're dropping out of their normal commodity existence, but they're also redeeming their commodity existence since they owe their existence to their commodity character. Right. So the thing with the flea market is that everything there was produced and consumed as a commodity. And I think that we talked about this with Baudelaire. Did we look at the draft introductions to the Fleur de Mal? Yeah, okay. So the romantic idea of art would be that art is precisely not a commodity. Right? It's like priceless works of art. And l'art polar, the cult of l'art polar, art is like useless, and that's why it's necessary. And Baudelaire is not doing that, right? He's not doing either of those things. He's not saying a work of art is priceless, nor is he saying that a work of art is defined by not being a commodity. In fact, he's saying the exact opposite. And the way Benjamin understands it when he says that here it is the commodity itself that speaks, it's that what makes a commodity is that it's in search of a buyer. But there are two different buyers, right? There's the employer is your buyer, who's going to buy your labor power. Being attractive to an employer to be purchased as a commodity that way. And then, of course, we have our notion of love, which is supposedly the opposite of that, and yet is also the same as that. That's why he starts with the whole thing about types. And the thing about the commodity economy is that it is random, meaning who an employer hires or what job you get is largely random. It's, is there a position that happens to be open, and does a candidate happen to come along when there's a position that's open? Right, and yet there's the question of like fit. There's like the employment fit, and there's the romantic fit, and that's why it's the Cinderella slipper, right? It's like the shoe that's you find the perfect fit. Now, so the paradox is that art seems to be defined by its resisting the commodity form, and yet even in resisting the commodity form, it's entirely defined by the commodity form. And I mentioned earlier, it seems like art is second-hand or used experience. It's not the original experience, it's the reproduction of that experience. So let's come back to this at the beginning of next class, because I feel like there are a couple of things that I'd like to touch on, and we'll use that as our transition to the Surrealism essay by Benjamin. But yeah, so again, love is supposed to be the complete opposite of the commodity economy in which we are commodities as workers, and yet is inseparable from that, in the same way that art seems to be defined as a commodity by its exemption from the commodity economy. And then I mentioned modernism is romanticism, but it's trying to give a positive value to what romanticism sees as a loss. Right. So, and also remains romantic in the sense that we try to hold on to this idea of art as somehow not capitalism. But even if we were to define it as not capitalism, it would still be dependent on capitalism for that definition of itself. Right, so he's thematizing it very precisely with the found object, Breton. Things that are destined for the trash, but have a new life and have a better existence the second time around, right? So the mask and the slipper spoon are much more than whatever they were originally as commodities. And yet they are trash. All right. So Liang is the second presenter. And you're on Canvas, but not, you're an observer, or you're registered for the class?
Yeah.
Oh, you are? Okay. I was trying to remember who's registered, who's auditing, because I know that I have, who are my auditors? You're an auditor. That's right. But I have more than one auditor. All right. I'll see you guys next week.